Hey, and welcome back. A few months ago, I shared a video repairing a few drums for a nearby middle school, and in the trade for my work, they let me take a variety of drums they had no more use for. Of the drums I was given, I got a whole slew of older Ludwig marching drums with a cool 3-band, 2-colored sparkle wrap. I've seen these drums a lot over the years, and in fact, my alma mater had a set of these that we used my freshman year in our school colors of blue and silver. As much as I appreciated the red and silver drums I was given, I had no affinity for the color scheme, as it wasn't the school colors of any of my schools, and I'm not a particularly big Wisconsin Badgers fan. As the months went by, a fellow vintage drum collector out of Madison shared a whole slew of similar Ludwig marchers on a Facebook group, but in a green and gold color scheme. When I reached out to him about acquiring one of these, he told me he had only 3 left, and the only way they were going to leave his personal collection was if they stayed in the state and went to another Green Bay Packers fan. Of course, those 2 qualifications were no issue for me, and I went ahead and picked up these drums. I ended up holding on to the 14x10 snare for my personal collection and passed on the other 2 to a serious Packers collector who lives directly across the street from Lambeau Field and also happens to be a co-founder of one of my favorite YouTube channels, Cheesehead TV. This snare was in fine shape structurally and sonically, but it did have a couple issues with the tri-band wrap and the badge. So first, the badge had been bent out of shape with the shell and needed to be removed, bent back into form, and reattached with a new grommet. This is actually a pretty simple process, so I knew I'd be able to handle this rather quickly. But as for the other issue, the center gold wrap portion of this shell seemed to have shrunk over time, leaving a small 1/4-inch gap between itself and the other top green portion of this wrap. I'm not sure how this happens, but it's a reoccurring issue I've seen on plenty of these drums over the years. The second issue with the wrap came down to the seam. It had loosened up over decades of use, and although whoever owned this drum previously tried to repair it by riveting it back together, it was really not going to be an option for me to simply adhere this back to the shell. I went online and reached out to the folks at Precision Drum Company about getting a small segment of wrap to use for this project, along with a replacement grommet and tool to install it. They were able to set me up with a slightly oversized piece of wrap in a near exact finish. I've worked with Precision Drum Co. in the past, and when it comes to wraps, they are my favorite shop to work with. I've actually gotten this exact same wrap color before from my Gretsch Playboy kit for the bass drum hoop inlays. So I knew the color and thickness of the wrap would be a perfect fit based off my leftover pieces I already had on hand.
Several long days later.
So after a few days, my package arrived in the mail, and I was able to open it up and see my grommet installation tool, a replacement grommet, and of course, my new gold sparkle wrap. So with everything I needed now in hand, I grabbed my snare and began the process of removing both heads, rims, tension rods, and snare wires. I then followed that up by working inside the shell to remove all the lugs, the snare throw, butt plate, and the internal muffler. And as you can vaguely see in the studio window behind me, I was able to enjoy some of my favorite weekly Cheesehead TV show, Packer Transplants, while I got to work on this drum. Next, I took this shell upstairs to remove the grommet, badge, and wrap. For the grommet and badge, I started by using a countersink bit in my drill to cut the flange from the inside of the shell, and I'd highly recommend working from the inside to avoid any potential damage to the actual badge outside the shell. Once I had drilled into a point where I felt the flange was broken, I took a pair of pliers to pull out the fragments so I could remove it from the shell. After a bit of prying and pushing on the remainder of the grommet, I was able to get it out and remove the badge safely from the shell so I could reuse it. Next, I shifted my attention to the wrap. In plenty of cases, I've found I could remove a wrap without any heat, just using a razor blade to break the seam where a little glue was holding onto the shell, but with these older Ludwig drums, they use adhesive around the entire shell. You may have seen recent videos on my channel where I dealt with this exact issue, but at least in those cases, I was removing the whole wrap and not just a segment. I had to be extremely careful in this setting to avoid doing any damage to either of the green bands of wrap outside the shell. After a good 15 to 20 minutes, I finally had everything removed and came back with a razor blade to clean up a few spots right at the edge where the 2 wraps met. But after that, I took some measurements around the shell to get a final width and brought this drum back downstairs out of my freezing cold garage to begin the process of prepping the new wrap. The segment I'd ordered from Precision Drum Company was exactly 3 inches wide, and although they would have been happy to cut a more precise measurement, I wanted to have a little extra room just to be sure after I removed this wrap. In the end, I needed a width of almost 2 15/16, so I was very careful to cut just the slightest portion of the wrap and went back and forth with dry fitting it to the shell to get a nice tight seam between all 3 segments. Once I had my wrap at the final width, I began the process of adhering it to the shell with contact cement. I worked in small 6 to 8 inch sections, adding cement to both the shell and wrap before bringing them in contact with each other. I repeated the process over and over again, just up until the point where the wrap was about to overlap itself. Before adhering the end of the wrap permanently, I peeled back enough of the protective plastic film on top of the wrap so I could overlap them, and then got this clamp down in place using a piece of wood to get even clamping pressure before setting this drum to dry. While I waited for my wrap to dry, I shifted my attention to cleaning up the hardware a bit, and although I've used a variety of methods on this channel before, this time I decided to use a mixture of warm water and dish soap to clean up the lugs, throw, and other metallic pieces. The hardware really wasn't rusted or scuffed up much, but since it's already off the shell, it made sense to clean it while I could. After letting everything sit for a while, I rinsed it out and brought the pieces back over to my desk to hand dry and clean with a wire brush. After I had all the hardware dried and cleaned, I was ready to grab my shell, peel back the protective film around the gold band, and begin reassembling. In addition to the glue holding this drum together, the lugs also act as a permanent clamp, so I was eager to get these on sooner rather than later to help add pressure onto the settling wrap. After I had all the lugs installed, I added the butt plate, but quickly shifted my attention over to the badge. It may seem weird that I skipped the throw off an internal muffler, but with all these pieces being in a vertical line on the shell, I didn't want any of that to get in the way as I reinstalled the grommet. Installing the grommet is actually super simple if you've never done it before. You can build your own tool to do this, but I bought one from Precision Drum Co. as I knew it would be the right size and length I need, and it was only $5. It's basically a bolt thin enough to fit through the grommet with a head that tapers down, so as you tighten it between the front and back, it bends the end of the grommet flat and holds it securely to the shell. After I had the grommet installed, I moved on to the internal muffler, and then finally my snare throw. And with everything now reattached to the shell, I could begin reheading and final assembly. But first, before seating the heads, I did add some bearing edge conditioner to seal up any voids left in the bearing edge. As I seated the heads and rims, I did go over the rims with some aluminum foil just to clean them up a bit, and once I got to threading tension rods, I added some white lithium grease to keep everything friction free. After I had both heads securely fastened to the shell, I could add the snare wires back and call this drum complete. I took some time away from another great matchup of the Packers beating the Bears to record a quick demo for you, so I'll let that play, and once it's over, I'll come back and let you know my final thoughts on this drum. So of course, I expect this drum to be a lifelong piece of my collection, as it speaks to not only my love of vintage drums, but my admiration for the NFL's all-time leader in wins and world championships. It sounds just as you'd expect, and it's a great tool in my studio, where I occasionally need a marching snare for different kinds of recording projects. But honestly, even if this instrument wasn't useful for playing, I'd be happy to keep this on my shelf and have it as a statement piece. If I could do it all over again, I'd probably invest in some strap clamps so I could more easily clamp the wrap around the shell, but the seal did end up being pretty tight. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this project, whether about the drum or my fandom for the greatest franchise in all of professional sports. So leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel to see more weekly content just like this. Until next time, thanks.